I showed up to my cousin's wedding reception expecting to be ignored, like always. Then my aunt laughed and asked, in front of everyone, "So how's it feel owning that $2.1 million house?" My parents froze like they'd seen a ghost, because that question exposed what they'd been hiding. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I didn't arrive at my cousin's wedding reception expecting anything memorable to happen to me because nothing ever did in my family unless it involved embarrassment or being quietly ignored, and I'd already learned not to hope for more than that. So I slipped into the ballroom like a background character, nodded politely at relatives who barely registered my face, and took a seat near the back where invisible people are supposed to sit, telling myself I'd stay long enough to be polite and then leave without anyone noticing, which had been the pattern my entire adult life. The reception was lavish in that aggressive way, where money isn't just spent, it's performed. Crystal chandeliers stacked like frozen fireworks above us, gold-trimmed tables, a live band playing music loud enough to drown out small talk, and a room full of people dressed like they wanted to be photographed even when no cameras were around. My parents were already seated near the front, laughing too loudly, leaning into conversations, doing that thing they always did when they were surrounded by extended family, performing the role of proud, accomplished parents even though I'd learned a long time ago that performance didn't include me. They hadn't asked about my life on the drive there, hadn't asked what I'd been working on, hadn't even asked how I was doing, just whether I planned to stay out of trouble tonight, said half joking, half warning, like my existence alone was a liability. I watched them from across the room, my mother adjusting her necklace, my father holding court with an uncle I barely knew, and I felt that familiar dull pressure in my chest, the one that comes from knowing you're technically part of a family, but emotionally excluded from it. Then my aunt arrived late, sweeping in with that dramatic energy she always had, hugging people loudly, laughing, drawing attention without trying, and when she spotted me, her face lit up with genuine surprise, the kind that still catches me off guard because I'm so unused to it. She hugged me tightly and said my name like she meant it, then pulled back and smiled and said, "I was just telling everyone how proud I am of you," which immediately made my stomach drop because that sentence didn't match my lived reality. I laughed awkwardly, unsure what she thought she knew, and before I could redirect or downplay it, she turned toward my parents' table and said, still smiling, still casual, "By the way, how are you settling into that $2.1 million house you own now? Still loving it?" The room didn't just go quiet, it stalled, like someone had paused a movie mid-frame, and I watched in real time as my parents froze, not metaphorically, not dramatically, but physically, my mother's hand hovering inches above her wine glass, my father's jaw locking so tight I could see the muscle jump, and I understood immediately that this wasn't surprise, this was exposure. No one spoke. My cousin stopped mid-laugh. The band's music filled the silence awkwardly, completely disconnected from the moment that had just detonated in the middle of the reception, and I sat there feeling heat crawl up my neck, my mind racing through possibilities, realizing at once that my parents didn't just not know about the house, they had actively constructed a version of me where something like that was impossible. My aunt, unaware she'd just pulled the pin on a grenade, tilted her head and said, "Oh, did I say something wrong?" My mother finally moved, setting her glass down too carefully, smiling a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "You must be mistaken," which was the exact moment I knew this wasn't going to stay quiet. I didn't correct her right away, not because I was scared, but because a strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes when something you've been carrying alone for years finally has witnesses. People began murmuring, glancing between us, curiosity sharpening in the air, and my father cleared his throat and said my name in a tone I recognized instantly, the one that meant we'll talk about this later, the one that meant stop embarrassing us. I looked at him and felt something shift, something cold and solid click into place, because for the first time I wasn't the one being caught off guard, they were. I smiled politely and said, "No, she's right." And that's when the room leaned in, because people always lean in when truth starts to surface in places it doesn't belong. My parents stared at me like they were trying to silently rewrite the moment, and I realized how carefully they'd curated the story of me for years, the vague career, the undefined success, the convenient omission of anything that would disrupt the hierarchy they were comfortable with. They'd let relatives assume I was struggling, let whispers fill in the gaps, never correcting them, never defending me, because my quiet accomplishments didn't serve the image they wanted to project. And here I was, sitting in a room full of people who shared my last name, watching that image crack. I want to pause right here for 1 second, because if you're watching this, I want to know where you're watching from, not out of politeness, but because if you've ever been the invisible one in your family, chances are you're scattered all over the world, building lives quietly, unnoticed. So tell me where you're watching from while I keep going. My aunt laughed nervously and said, "Well, that's incredible." And someone behind her whispered, "Did you know about this?" And the question floated through the room like smoke. My mother finally turned to me and said, "Why wouldn't you tell us something like that?" And I almost laughed, because the answer was so obvious it hurt. I didn't say it yet, though, because this wasn't just about a house. It was about years of selective attention, about how they'd trained me to keep things to myself, by showing me over and over again that my milestones were inconvenient at best and disruptive at worst. My father leaned closer and said under his breath, "We'll discuss this later." And that was when I realized later wasn't coming anymore. Not for them. Not for me. The truth had slipped out in public, and whatever they'd been hiding, whatever story they'd been maintaining, was already unraveling. What they didn't know yet, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that the house wasn't the real problem. It was just the first crack, and once cracks form, the pressure behind them doesn't stop. It keeps pushing until something gives, and what was about to give wasn't just their image. It was the entire narrative they'd built about who I was, who mattered, and who didn't. And the worst part for them was this. I hadn't planned this moment, I hadn't orchestrated it, and I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but now that it was happening, I wasn't going to save them from it either. The silence after I said, "She's right," didn't break. It thickened, like the room itself was deciding whether to pretend nothing had happened or lean fully into the spectacle, and I could feel eyes crawling over me from every direction, measuring, recalculating, trying to reconcile the quiet background version of me they thought they knew with the fact that I apparently owned a house worth more than most of them would see in a lifetime. And my parents were still frozen. Not angry yet, not defensive yet, just exposed in that uniquely humiliating way where your private ignorance becomes public knowledge. My mother was the first to recover enough to speak, but instead of asking how or congratulating me or even pretending to be proud, she did what she always did when reality didn't match her internal script. She tried to correct it, saying my name softly but sharply. "You're exaggerating," like this was a misunderstanding she could tidy up with tone alone. I shook my head, still calm, still polite, because I'd learned long ago that raising my voice only made them more committed to not hearing me, and I said, "No, I'm not," which was enough to make a few people nearby audibly inhale. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossing defensively, scanning the room like he was suddenly aware of the audience, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation he'd used my entire life. How does this look? Who's watching? How do we control the narrative? My aunt, bless her unintentional chaos, laughed again and said, "Well, I should hope she's not exaggerating. I saw the place myself." And that was when the murmuring turned into full-blown whispering, names passing between lips, phones subtly coming out, curiosity igniting like dry tinder. Someone asked, "Where is it?" Someone else said, "Did you hear that number?" And my cousin's wedding reception had quietly stopped being about the bride. My mother's smile tightened, and she reached for my arm, gripping it just enough to signal urgency, and hissed, "Why wouldn't you tell us something like this?" And there it was, the question she'd been sitting on for years, not because she wanted to know me, but because she wanted to know why I hadn't fed her information she could use. I looked at her hand on my arm, then at her face, and something in me snapped into clarity, not anger, not rage, just truth, and I said, "You never asked," which landed harder than I expected, because it wasn't dramatic, it was factual, and facts are much harder to argue with than emotions. My father scoffed under his breath and said, "That's not fair, the automatic defense," the one he used whenever accountability got too close, and I turned to him and said, "Then tell me when you did ask," and the pause that followed was long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough for few people to stop pretending they weren't listening. He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "We didn't think it was that serious." And that sentence told the entire story in 8 words. Not that they didn't know, not that they'd been misinformed, but that they'd assumed my life wasn't worth tracking closely. Someone nearby laughed awkwardly, and I could feel the energy shift, that dangerous moment when private family dynamics start becoming public entertainment, and part of me wanted to shut it down, to save everyone the embarrassment, but another part of me, the part that had swallowed years of dismissal, thought, no, let it sit, let it breathe, let it be seen. My aunt stepped in again, clearly sensing tension but not understanding its depth, and said, well, regardless, it's impressive, and turned to my parents with a smile that was now slightly confused. You must be so proud. And my mother nodded too quickly, saying, of course we are, in that rehearsed way that didn't match her eyes. I realized then that pride, for them, was always conditional, activated only when success could be displayed, leveraged, talked about at dinner parties, and because they hadn't known about mine, it might as well not have existed. I felt a strange mix of vindication and grief. Vindication because the truth was finally undeniable. Grief because it took a public moment for them to even pretend to see me. The band shifted songs, trying to recover the mood, but the spell was broken, conversations fragmented, people kept glancing back at us, and my father leaned in again, voice low, controlled, saying, we'll talk about this later, not here. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't know him that. I didn't know him privacy when my entire existence had been treated like an afterthought. I said, just loud enough for the immediate circle to hear, there's nothing to talk about. And that was the moment my mother's composure finally cracked. Her eyes flashed, not with concern, but with embarrassment, and she said, you didn't have to make a scene. And I almost laughed, because the irony was so sharp it hurt. I hadn't said the number, I hadn't announced anything, I hadn't stood up and claimed attention. All I'd done was confirm a fact when asked, and somehow that was a scene. I could see it then, as clear as day, how my existence had always been framed as disruptive whenever it threatened to pull focus away from the roles they preferred. I took a breath and said, I didn't make a scene, I answered a question, and I watched as a few people nearby nodded subtly, recognizing the imbalance even if they didn't understand it fully. At that point, I need to pause again because if you're still with me, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What country? Because moments like this hit differently depending on where you are in your own story. So tell me while I keep going. The reception limped on, but the damage was done, and I spent the next half hour fielding quiet questions from relatives who suddenly remembered my name, asking what I did, how long I'd been there, how I'd managed it. Each question a small confirmation of what I'd always known, that attention follows perceived value, not blood. My parents stayed unusually close to me, hovering, intercepting conversations, correcting details they clearly didn't understand, trying to reassert control over a narrative they'd lost, and it was exhausting to watch. At one point, my mother pulled me aside near the restrooms and said, you should have told us. Again, like this was a mutual failing, and I finally said what I'd never let myself say before. I stopped sharing when it stopped mattering, and her face fell, not because she understood, but because she heard finality in my voice. My father joined us, arms crossed, posture rigid, and said, we raised you better than this, which was almost funny, because what he meant was, we raised you to stay small. I looked at him and said, you raised me to be independent. And that shut him up, because it was true, just not in the way he intended. Eventually, I left early, not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly, and as I walked out into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped carrying their version of me. My phone buzzed before I even reached my car, my mother's name lighting up the screen, then my father's, then again, and I let it ring, not out of spite, but because I needed space to think. Driving home, the images replayed in my mind, the frozen glasses, the whispered questions, the look on my parents' faces when they realized they'd missed something significant, and I realized this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning they weren't prepared for. Because here's what they still didn't know, what they couldn't possibly guess as they scrambled to regain footing. The house was only the most visible piece, the easiest one for outsiders to understand, and when the rest came out, not if, when, it would force them to confront not just their ignorance, but the cost of it. And that confrontation, the one they were already trying to avoid, was coming faster than they thought, because the moment you stop hiding your truth to make others comfortable, everything changes and nothing goes back to the way it was. The next morning hit differently, not with drama, but with that quiet pressure that sits on your chest when you know something fundamental has shifted and there's no way to pretend it hasn't. And I woke up to my phone buzzing like it had been possessed, missed calls stacked on missed calls, texts layered on top of each other from my parents, my cousin, even relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly finding my number. And I just stared at it for a long minute before rolling over, because I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't concern, it wasn't curiosity, it was damage control. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the silence of my house remind me of something important, that this life existed whether they acknowledged it or not, that the walls didn't change because someone else finally noticed them. When I did check the messages, the pattern was obvious, my mother leading with worry and confusion. "Are you okay? Last night got out of hand." My father jumping straight to authority. "We need to talk today." And then the secondary wave, aunts saying how proud they were, cousins asking what I actually did for a living, all of it confirming the same truth. Visibility changes everything, not because you change, but because people do. I ignored them all for hours, not as punishment, but because I needed to hear my own thoughts without theirs interrupting, and as I went about my day, I kept replaying moments from my childhood that suddenly made more sense. The school award ceremonies where my parents arrived late or not at all. The report cards that got a nod and a good job before the conversation moved on. The college graduation where my mother spent more time taking photos of my cousin than listening to my name being called. Moments I dismissed as small at the time, but now lined up like evidence. By early afternoon, my father showed up unannounced, pulling into my driveway like this was still a place he had automatic access to, and when I opened the door, his expression was a mix of irritation and forced calm, the look he used when he was trying to stay in control of a situation he didn't understand. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, glancing around like he was seeing the space for the first time, and I watched his eyes linger on details he'd never bothered to ask about before. The finishes, the artwork, the quiet confidence of the place, and I could almost hear the mental recalibration happening. He didn't start with congratulations or questions. He started with criticism, saying, "You embarrassed your mother." Like that was the core issue, not the years of absence that led up to it, and I felt something steady settle in me. Not anger, but resolve. I said, "She was embarrassed because she didn't know me," and that stopped him mid-sentence. He tried again, shifting tactics, saying, "You blindsided us," and I said, "I lived my life," and that was when his voice sharpened, accusing me of secrecy, of being deliberately distant, and I realized this was the narrative he needed, that my independence was a betrayal, that my silence was an attack, because the alternative meant admitting he hadn't been paying attention. I asked him a simple question, "What do you think I do for work?" And he hesitated just long enough to answer vaguely, something about management and investments, and I said, "You don't know." Not cruelly, just plainly, and the room went quiet again. He sat down heavily, running a hand over his face, and for the first time, I saw something like uncertainty crack through his posture, but instead of sitting with it, he doubled down, saying families share things, families don't hide success, and I laughed softly, because the irony was unbearable. I told him I'd learned early that sharing didn't lead to support. It led to minimization, to comparison, to being told I was doing fine and didn't need attention, and he shook his head, saying I was exaggerating, and I reminded him of specifics, dates, moments. The Thanksgiving where he'd interrupted me mid-sentence to ask about someone else's promotion. The birthday where my gift went unopened for hours because another announcement took priority, and I watched his certainty falter with each example. Halfway through that conversation, my mother called, and I let it ring, not out of spite, but because I needed him to hear this without her cushioning it, and when I finally answered, I put it on speaker, and she immediately launched into emotional repair mode, apologizing without specificity, saying she never meant to hurt me, saying they were proud, always proud, and I said, "Pride without presence doesn't count." And the line went silent. That's when the question started changing, shifting from "Why didn't you tell us?" to "How did you do it? What else have we missed?" And there it was, the hunger for information now that it had social value. I stopped them both and said something I'd never said out loud before, that my success wasn't a family achievement. It wasn't something they got to claim retroactively. It was built in the absence of their involvement, not because of it. And that didn't mean I hated them, but it did mean the relationship couldn't reset overnight. I need to pause here again because if you're listening to this and it's hitting a nerve, I want to know where you're watching from, what part of the world you're in, because this dynamic doesn't belong to one family or one culture. It shows up everywhere, just in different costumes. After that conversation ended, not with resolution but with exhaustion, the ripple effects began immediately. Relatives reaching out with apologies that felt more like curiosity, invitations suddenly extended, interest blooming where indifference had lived for years, and it was overwhelming in a way I hadn't expected. I realized then that recognition can feel invasive when it comes too late, that being seen after years of invisibility doesn't automatically feel good. It feels destabilizing, like your boundaries are being tested by people who never respected them before. That evening, alone again, I sat with the discomfort and understood something crucial, that my parents weren't reacting to my success. They were reacting to the loss of control over the story they'd been telling about me. The version where I was fine but unremarkable, safe but small, and now that version was unusable. What they didn't know yet, what they couldn't see past the shock of the house itself, was that this was only the most visible thread to pull, and as they kept pulling, more would unravel. Things they'd assumed, dynamics they'd never questioned, and the consequences of that unraveling were going to force choices they weren't prepared to make. Because once a family sees what it's ignored, it has to decide whether to change or to retreat deeper into denial. And that decision was coming whether they liked it or not. The days that followed blurred together in a way that felt surreal, like living inside a house where the furniture kept rearranging itself every time you turned around, and suddenly everyone wanted a seat at the table they'd never bothered to ask about before. Calls from relatives who used to forget my birthday now framed as check-ins. Texts padded with emojis and fake casualness. Invitations to lunches and dinners that carried the unmistakable weight of curiosity. And what struck me most wasn't the attention itself, but how transactional it felt, like my existence had finally gained a price tag. My parents shifted tone completely, my mother calling with a softness that felt rehearsed, my father speaking carefully as if every word was being weighed for future use, and both of them circling the same question without asking it outright, wanting to know how secure I really was, how permanent this life was, as if permanence determined how they should treat me. I let them talk, not because I needed answers, but because listening confirmed something I'd suspected for years, that their interest was conditional, responsive to optics rather than substance, and that hurt more than the silence ever did. One afternoon, my aunt stopped by unannounced, standing in my entryway clutching a gift bag like a peace offering, eyes scanning the space with a mixture of awe and calculation, and she launched into a story about how proud the family was, how they'd always known I'd do well, rewriting history in real time, and I let her finish before calmly reminding her of the times she'd told me to be realistic, to temper my ambitions, to not expect too much, and she laughed it off, calling it encouragement. And that word stuck with me because encouragement without belief is just dismissal dressed up nicely. That night, alone again, I thought about how often families confuse familiarity with intimacy, how knowing someone's role doesn't mean knowing the person, and how easy it is to overlook what doesn't demand attention. The next escalation came quietly, not with confrontation but with expectation, my parents asking if I'd be coming to the next family gathering, framing it as an opportunity to reconnect. And I realized what they were really asking was whether I was ready to re-enter the old system, to show up and play my part now that the script had changed. And the answer wasn't simple because part of me still wanted what I'd always wanted, to be included without conditions, to be seen without performance. I said maybe, and that maybe hung between us like a test they were sure they'd pass. When the gathering finally happened, smaller and less formal than the wedding, the energy was unmistakable. Conversations stopping when I entered, smiles a little too wide, questions a little too pointed, and I could feel the recalibration happening in real time. People try to place me correctly now that the old category no longer fit. Midway through that afternoon, as I stood in the kitchen listening to two cousins debate my career like it was a group project, I want to pause again and ask you where you're watching from, because if you've ever walked into a room and felt people reassessing your worth based on new information, you're not alone in this. The tension finally broke when my mother pulled me aside, eyes glossy, voice trembling, asking if I was angry, and I answered honestly that anger wasn't the right word, that what I felt was distance, the kind that grows when understanding arrives too late, and she cried quietly, apologizing again, promising to do better, and I believed she meant it in that moment. But belief doesn't erase patterns. My father joined us, awkward and stiff, and tried to bridge the gap with logic, talking about miscommunication, about how families miss things, and I stopped him gently, telling him this wasn't about missing things, it was about choosing what mattered, and that landed harder than any accusation. The aftermath of that conversation lingered, not in raised voices, but in the uncomfortable awareness that things couldn't go back to the way they were, that whatever came next would require actual change, not just intention. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle shifts, my parents asking more specific questions, listening longer, my mother sending articles related to my work, my father mentioning my achievements to others, and while part of me appreciated the effort, another part stayed cautious, aware of how easily momentum can fade once the novelty wears off. What complicated everything was my cousin, the one whose wedding had sparked this whole unraveling, reaching out privately to apologize for her part in the dynamic, admitting she'd benefited from attention without questioning its source, and that conversation cracked something open in me, not resentment, but clarity, because it reminded me that systems persist not just because of malice, but because of inertia. As I navigated these shifting relationships, I also noticed something else changing, my own internal landscape, the way I no longer felt the urge to prove or explain, the way silence no longer felt like rejection, and that was when I understood the real turning point wasn't their recognition, it was my detachment from needing it. The pressure continued to build though, subtle expectations stacking up, hints about support, about involvement, about being more present now that I had the means, and I saw the crossroads approaching, the moment where I'd have to decide how much access to grant, how much to protect, because recognition often comes with entitlement, and entitlement doesn't ask, it assumes. One evening, after a particularly loaded phone call, I sat in my living room and thought about the difference between reconciliation and reentry, about how healing doesn't require returning to harm, and that realization steadied me. I began setting boundaries, small at first, declining invitations, shortening calls, choosing when and how to engage, and the reactions were immediate: confusion, disappointment, subtle guilt tripping, and there it was again, the familiar undertow, only now I could see it clearly. What they didn't realize yet, what none of them were prepared for, was that my visibility had triggered more than curiosity. It had exposed dependencies, assumptions, and expectations that had been quietly forming beneath the surface, and as those came into focus, someone was going to ask for something they'd never earned, and when that moment arrived, the true test wouldn't be my success. It would be my refusal to let it be used against me, because the next request wouldn't be about understanding or connection, it would be about leverage, and how I responded would redefine the family dynamic in a way none of us could walk back from. The ask finally came the way these things always do, wrapped in softness, framed as concern, disguised as reasonableness. My mother calling on a quiet weekday afternoon with that careful tone that meant she was about to cross a line she already knew existed, starting with small talk about the weather, about a neighbor's surgery, about nothing at all, until she slowly eased into the real subject, mentioning how hard things had been lately, how unpredictable the economy felt, how families needed to stick together more than ever, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest because I'd heard this preamble before, just never aimed at me, and when she finally said it, when she casually mentioned that my father was considering retiring earlier than planned, and they were worried about cash flow, the word worried hanging there like bait, I knew exactly where this was going. She didn't ask outright, not yet. She circled it, talked about how proud they were, how impressive my stability was, how comforting it must feel to know I was secure, and the subtext grew louder with every sentence until I interrupted her gently and asked what she needed, and there was a pause on the line long enough to confirm everything. Then she said they were hoping I could help bridge a gap, just temporarily, just until things stabilized, and I remember staring out my window at a life I'd built inch by inch, and realizing this was the moment everything before had been quietly preparing me for. I didn't respond immediately, not because I was shocked, but because I was taking inventory of my own emotions, checking for anger, resentment, guilt, and finding instead something colder and clearer, and understanding that this wasn't about money at all. It was about access, about entitlement catching up to visibility, and I asked her directly how long this gap was expected to last, what amount they were talking about, and what plan existed beyond my contribution, and she faltered, giving vague answers, deflecting specifics, emphasizing trust and family, and how they'd never ask if it wasn't necessary. And that was when I knew they hadn't changed as much as they wanted me to believe. I told her I'd think about it, and we ended the call politely, but the quiet afterward was heavy, my phone sitting face down like it might ring again if I acknowledged it, and I sat there replaying not just the conversation but the years behind it, the missed calls, the forgotten milestones, the assumptions that I'd always be fine without support, and now suddenly I was being positioned as the solution to a problem I hadn't created. That evening my father called too, more direct, less emotional, laying out numbers, projecting calm, framing it as an investment in family stability, and that word investment hit differently because I understood investments, I understood risk and return, and I understood when someone wanted upside without accountability. He talked about everything they'd done for me growing up, the sacrifices they'd made, the support they'd provided, rewriting the past in a way that almost impressed me with its confidence, and I let him finish before reminding him gently that support wasn't something you retroactively assign, it's something you demonstrate consistently, and the silence that followed told me he hadn't expected resistance. Over the next few days the pressure increased, not overtly but persistently, relatives chiming in with concern, casual comments about how lucky my parents were to have such a capable child, suggestions framed as compliments, and I realized this wasn't just a request, it was a test, one that would determine whether my newfound visibility came with boundaries or obligations. At the midpoint of all this, I want to pause and ask you where you're watching from, because if you've ever been elevated in the eyes of people who once overlooked you and immediately felt the weight of expectations settle on your shoulders, you understand this moment. I spent a long night thinking about the difference between generosity and enablement, about how helping someone once can turn into being responsible forever if you don't draw lines early, and about how families often confuse access with entitlement, especially when success enters the picture. The next conversation was the hardest because it required clarity instead of avoidance, and I told my parents that I was open to supporting them, but only under conditions that required transparency, planning, and shared responsibility, not dependency, and their reaction was immediate and emotional. My mother accusing me of being transactional, my father warning me about damaging the relationship, and there it was again, the subtle threat that love could be withdrawn if I didn't
comply.
I told them calmly that relationships damaged by honesty were already fragile, and that my willingness to help couldn't come at the cost of my autonomy or peace, and the call ended tense, unresolved, leaving all of us sitting with the discomfort of a dynamic that had finally shifted. What followed surprised me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing, a sudden cooling, fewer calls, shorter messages, a palpable sense of disappointment that didn't bother to hide itself, and I realized that their warmth had been conditional all along, responsive to what they believed I could provide rather than who I was. That realization didn't hurt the way it might have once. Instead, it settled into place like a final piece of a puzzle, confirming what I'd felt for years but hadn't fully accepted. A week later, my cousin reached out again, this time more serious, warning me that my parents were upset, that they felt rejected, that they were telling people I'd changed, that success had made me distant, and I laughed softly because it wasn't success that had created distance, it was clarity. I responded kindly but firmly, saying I hadn't changed, I'd just stopped compensating for imbalance, and that landed harder than any argument could. The real reckoning came quietly, not with confrontation but with absence, my parents skipping a gathering I hosted, citing discomfort, and I saw the pattern complete itself. Proximity offered only when it served them, withdrawn when it didn't, and I understood then that whatever came next wouldn't be resolved through conversation alone. I continued living my life, working, building, enjoying the stability I'd earned, and the noise gradually faded, replaced by a quieter but more honest distance, and in that space I found something unexpected, relief, not from conflict but from expectation, from the unspoken demand to constantly prove my worth through usefulness. The final call of this phase came late one night, my mother again, voice tired, less performative, admitting they'd been hurt but also acknowledging they hadn't handled things well, asking if there was a way forward, and I told her there was. But it would require accepting that my success didn't obligate me to solve everyone else's problems, that love without control was the only kind I was interested in now. She didn't respond immediately, and that silence stretched into days, and I let it, understanding that growth often happens offstage, if it happens at all. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't see coming, was that this refusal, this boundary, had set off a chain reaction beyond my parents, that someone else in the family had been counting on my compliance, had already factored my resources into their plans, and when those plans began to unravel, the next confrontation wouldn't be wrapped in politeness or concern, it would be raw, direct, and impossible to ignore. Because the moment you stop being useful to people who feel entitled to you, they don't just get disappointed, they get angry. And the next chapter wouldn't be about subtle pressure or quiet disappointment. It would be about confrontation, accusation, and the final test of whether visibility would cost me my peace or finally free me from it. The confrontation didn't arrive with drama or raised voices at first. It arrived as a text message on a Sunday morning that simply said, "We need to talk today." No greeting, no context, just expectation, and I knew immediately who it was from before I even unlocked my phone, because when entitlement gets threatened, it doesn't ask, it summons. It was my aunt, the same one who had smiled too brightly at the wedding reception, the same one who had casually dropped the house question like a match into dry grass, and the timing told me everything. Whatever financial math had been happening behind the scenes had finally failed. I didn't respond right away, not out of fear, but because I wanted to choose my state of mind before walking into what I already knew would be an ambush disguised as concern, and when I did reply, it was simple, calm, and non-committal, asking what she wanted to talk about. Her response came instantly, long, emotionally loaded, filled with words like family, responsibility, misunderstanding, and urgency, and by the time I finished reading it, I realized this wasn't about clearing the air, it was about control slipping and someone scrambling to grab it back. We agreed to meet that afternoon at my parents' house, neutral territory in theory, but historically never neutral in practice, and as I drove there I felt that strange mix of tension and clarity that only comes when you've already decided who you are but other people haven't caught up yet. The living room was already occupied when I arrived, my parents on the couch, my aunt and uncle across from them, and the seating arrangement alone told a story, sides chosen before I'd even walked in, and as soon as I sat down my aunt leaned forward and started speaking before anyone else could, launching into a narrative about how shocked and hurt she'd been by my distance, how confused everyone was by my sudden boundaries, how this family had always been close, always supportive, and I let her talk because I wanted to hear how she framed the past when she thought I wouldn't interrupt. She spoke about sacrifices, about unity, about how money changes people, and there it was, the accusation without naming it, the implication that success had made me cold, selfish, less loyal, and when she finally paused, I calmly asked her what specifically she wanted from me, and the shift in her expression was immediate, the performance dropping just enough to reveal irritation underneath. She said there had been discussions, plans made with the assumption that family resources could be pooled, that opportunities were on the table that required backing, that it would be foolish not to leverage success within the family, and as she spoke, I realized this wasn't a reaction to my boundaries, it was a response to a loss they'd already counted on absorbing, and I asked her plainly what kind of backing she was referring to. She hesitated, looked at my uncle, then explained they were in the middle of refinancing properties, expanding a business venture that hadn't gone as expected, that there were short-term liquidity issues, and that my involvement could solve a lot of stress for everyone. I listened without interrupting, noting how the language kept shifting from their problem to our opportunity, from their risk to shared benefit, and when she finished, I asked the same question I'd asked my parents days earlier: what plan existed that didn't involve my money? The room went quiet in that specific way that tells you the answer was never intended to be discussed, and my uncle cleared his throat, talking about timing, about trust, about how families shouldn't need contracts or conditions, and that was when I finally spoke more than a sentence at a time. I told them that trust without transparency isn't trust, it's expectation, that pooling resources without shared decision-making isn't collaboration, it's entitlement, and that I wasn't interested in funding plans I hadn't helped create or risks I wasn't allowed to assess. My aunt bristled, saying I was being defensive, that no one was attacking me, that they were just asking for support, and I responded calmly that asking implies the freedom to say no without punishment, something this conversation clearly didn't allow. My mother tried to intervene then, asking everyone to calm down, reminding us that we were family, and I gently pointed out that family doesn't mean access without consent, that closeness doesn't erase autonomy, and that love shouldn't come with invoices. That was when the tone finally cracked, my aunt's voice rising as she accused me of forgetting where I came from, of benefiting from a family name and now acting above it, of hoarding success instead of sharing it, and I remember noticing how familiar that accusation felt, how often overlooked children are expected to repay neglect with generosity once they succeed. I told her I hadn't forgotten where I came from, I just stopped letting that place define what I owed, and I reminded her that no one had invested in me when there was nothing to gain, that my education, my work, my progress had been mine to manage alone, and that it was strange how collective responsibility only became important once there was something tangible to distribute. My father looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, and I could tell this wasn't how he'd imagined the conversation going, but I also knew he'd allowed it to happen, allowed expectations to grow unchecked, and I asked him directly if he'd known about these plans. He admitted he had, quietly, that there had been conversations, assumptions, that it all felt easier when they believed I'd be willing, and I nodded because that was the truth finally spoken aloud. Willingness assumed, consent bypassed. At that point I stood up, not to leave, but to change the dynamic, to remove myself from the physical posture of defense, and I told them something I hadn't planned to say, but knew needed to be heard, that my success wasn't a family asset, it was a personal outcome, that I wasn't a safety net or a contingency plan, and that anyone who wanted access to my resources needed to first demonstrate respect for my boundaries, my process, and my right to say no without being villainized. The reaction was mixed, my aunt scoffing, my uncle shaking his head, my mother crying softly, and my father staring at the floor. And in that moment I understood that not everyone wants fairness, some people just want predictability, and my refusal to play the expected role had disrupted more than finances, it had disrupted identity. I told them I wasn't closing the door on relationships, but I was closing it firmly on assumptions, that any future involvement would require clarity, documentation, shared risk, and mutual respect, not emotional leverage, and that if those terms felt offensive it was because entitlement had been mistaken for closeness for too long. The room stayed quiet after that, heavy with unspoken thoughts, and eventually my aunt stood up, saying she didn't recognize me anymore, that this wasn't how family behaved, and I replied evenly that maybe it never had been. Maybe it was just how they'd expected me to behave, and that difference mattered. She left shortly after, my uncle following, and when the door closed behind them the house felt emptier but lighter, like air rushing back into a space that had been compressed for years. My parents didn't speak right away, and I didn't rush to fill the silence, because some realizations need room to breathe, and when my mother finally asked if I was okay, I told her I was more okay than I'd been in a long time because clarity, even when it costs comfort, is still peace. I left not long after, driving home with a sense of finality that didn't feel like loss so much as alignment, and as the days passed the fallout became clearer, fewer messages, colder tones, stories circulating about my arrogance, my distance, my so-called transformation, and I let them circulate, understanding that when you stop participating in narratives written by others, they often get louder before they disappear. What I didn't expect was how that confrontation would ripple outward, how cousins I barely spoke to would suddenly reach out with carefully worded questions, how friends of the family would start watching me differently, measuring reactions, recalibrating assumptions, and I realized I wasn't just redefining one relationship, I was challenging a hierarchy that had relied on my silence. And somewhere in that quiet recalibration, something shifted internally too, a release of responsibility I hadn't realized I was carrying, the unspoken job of maintaining harmony at my own expense, and I started sleeping better, working with more focus, enjoying my life without the background hum of obligation. But just as things began to settle, just as the distance started to feel normal, a new message arrived, this one shorter, sharper, from someone I hadn't expected to hear from directly, someone who had been counting on my compliance in ways I hadn't yet uncovered, and as I read it I understood that the real test hadn't happened yet, because when boundaries disrupt plans, people don't always retreat. Sometimes they escalate. And the next move wouldn't be wrapped in family language or polite concern. It would be strategic, personal, and designed to force a choice I'd already made, whether I liked it or not. The message didn't come with pleasantries or context. It came with confidence, the kind that assumes leverage before it's earned. And it was from my cousin, the groom from the wedding, the one who had smiled awkwardly during the reception while my aunt's question detonated the room. And his text said we should grab coffee and clear the air because things were getting unnecessarily tense. I remember staring at that sentence and almost laughing because people who benefit from tension rarely feel it themselves. They just notice when it stops working in their favor, and I agreed to meet him not because I owed him clarity, but because I wanted to see which version of the story he'd been told and how comfortable he felt carrying it. We met at a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral ground again, and he was already seated when I arrived, laptop open, posture relaxed. The body language of someone who believed this was a conversation between equals, even though he'd never treated it that way before. He started by saying he didn't want to take sides, that he valued family harmony, that weddings had a way of magnifying misunderstandings, and I let him speak because people reveal their strategy and how they frame concern. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how my aunt and uncle were spiraling and how my parents were caught in the middle. And then he said something that made the entire purpose of the meeting snap into focus. He said that my refusal to help financially had created instability that could affect his new marriage, his future plans, and that I needed to understand the broader impact of my decisions. I asked him calmly how my boundaries had anything to do with his marriage, and he hesitated before explaining that there were shared investments planned, assumptions made about capital flow, expectations that hadn't been formalized but had been relied upon. And as he spoke, I realized this wasn't just family pressure. It was a network of quiet dependencies that had been built on the belief that I wouldn't say no. He told me he wasn't asking for money directly, not yet, but that flexibility would go a long way, that reassurance could calm nerves, that my silence was being interpreted as hostility, and I told him that silence is only threatening to people who expected access without permission. His expression tightened, irritation breaking through the diplomat mask, and he said I was being rigid, that wealth comes with responsibility whether I liked it or not, that family ecosystems function best when everyone contributes according to their capacity, and I leaned back and asked him a question that clearly wasn't part of his prepared script. I asked him what he'd contributed to me. He blinked, surprised, and laughed lightly as if it were a joke, saying contribution isn't transactional, that family support shows up in different ways, and I told him that was interesting because the only support anyone could articulate now was financial, and it all flowed in one direction. He tried to pivot then, talking about reputation, about how stories were forming, about how people were questioning my character, and I told him that people who benefit from your compliance always reframe your refusal as a flaw because it protects their narrative, and that I wasn't interested in managing perceptions built on entitlement. That was when his tone shifted fully, the pretense of neutrality dropping, and he said something sharp about gratitude, about remembering who stood by me when I was younger, and I reminded him gently that standing by someone requires noticing them, something he'd never done until he thought I could be useful. He went quiet then, tapping his fingers against his coffee cup, and finally said what he'd been circling since the start, that if I continued down this path, I risked isolating myself from the family entirely, that people wouldn't forget this, that bridges once burned don't rebuild easily, and I told him bridges built on obligation aren't bridges, they're toll roads, and I'd stopped paying. He stood shortly after, clearly frustrated, saying he hoped I'd reconsider before things went too far, and I watched him leave knowing that what he called too far was simply beyond his control. The fallout from that meeting was swift and coordinated in a way that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Messages from extended relatives suddenly arriving with similar phrasing, similar concerns, similar appeals to unity and tradition, and I could almost see the group chat where they'd align their language, rehearse their angles, and I didn't respond to most of them, choosing instead to observe how quickly people reveal their priorities when leverage fails. What surprised me wasn't the pressure itself, but how comfortable they were applying it, how little discomfort they felt attempting to guilt me into compliance, and I realized then that my silence in the past hadn't been neutrality, it had been permission. My parents called again, voices tired, asking if there was any way to soften my stance, to offer something symbolic to ease tensions, And I told them that symbolism without substance is how problems get postponed instead of solved, and that I wouldn't be participating in emotional theater designed to keep others comfortable. My mother cried, saying she didn't recognize the family anymore, and I told her gently that families don't fall apart when someone sets boundaries. They fall apart when they were only held together by someone else's sacrifice. Days passed, then weeks, and the atmosphere shifted from confrontation to quiet retaliation. Invitations stopped, updates ceased, conversations went cold, and I noticed how quickly proximity disappeared once access was denied. And instead of feeling lonely, I felt strangely free, like I'd been released from a role I never auditioned for. I poured that energy into my work, into my life, into friendships that didn't require justification, and I started to see how much mental space had been occupied by managing expectations that were never fair to begin with. But just as the noise faded into something manageable, a new development surfaced, one that escalated things beyond emotional pressure into something more calculated, because I received an email from a lawyer, formal, polite, and unmistakably threatening in its implications, referencing family trusts, shared assets, vague claims about verbal agreements, and my name positioned not as a relative, but as a potential obstacle. I remember reading it twice, feeling that familiar calm settle in, the kind that arrives when lines are crossed so clearly that doubt evaporates, and I forwarded it to my attorney without a word. When my lawyer called me later that day, her tone was composed but alert, explaining that while the claims were weak, the intent was obvious. They were testing boundaries, probing for fear, hoping legal intimidation would succeed where guilt had failed, and she asked me if I wanted to respond aggressively or strategically. I told her I wanted to respond truthfully, which in this context meant decisively, and within days she drafted a response that dismantled their assumptions point by point, clarifying ownership, denying implied consent, and making it clear that further attempts would be met with counters they wouldn't enjoy. The reaction was immediate and chaotic: angry calls, panicked messages, accusations of betrayal, and I watched it all from a distance that felt earned. Because once someone tries to turn family into litigation, the moral high ground disappears entirely. My parents were horrified, apologizing again, saying they never intended for things to go this far, and I told them that intentions don't stop consequences, patterns do, and that this was the natural end of years of unchecked entitlement. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved, and there's a difference, because victory implies opposition, while resolution implies completion. As the weeks turned into months, the legal threats faded, replaced by a cold silence that spoke louder than any argument, and in that quiet I rebuilt my understanding of family from the ground up, not as a birthright but as a choice, not as obligation but as alignment. Some relationships didn't survive the shift, others surprised me by adapting, and a few new ones formed in the space left behind. And through it all I learned something that no one teaches you when you're the overlooked one: that success doesn't just change how others see you, it forces them to confront the version of you they relied on, and when that version disappears, not everyone will wish you well. But as I stood one evening on the balcony of the house they'd once tried to claim by proxy, watching the city settle into night, I understood that the hardest part wasn't standing up to them. It was accepting that some people only love you when you're useful, and walking away from that love is not loss, it's liberation. And just as that realization settled in, my phone buzzed again, a new message, shorter than the rest, from someone I hadn't heard from since before the wedding, someone whose silence had always been strategic. And as I read it, I knew the story wasn't done yet, because when power shifts, there's always one last attempt to rewrite the ending, and the next move would be the boldest one yet. The message came from my father this time, and it was different from the others. No pressure, no guilt language, no thinly veiled threats, just a single sentence asking if we could talk privately, just the two of us, because there were things he should have said years ago, and things he needed to say now before it was too late. I read it twice, set my phone down, walked through the house slowly, letting the silence stretch, because when people ask for private conversations after everything explodes, it's rarely about accountability and more often about damage control. But something in the phrasing told me this wasn't about money or leverage or reputation. It was about fear, the quiet kind that comes when someone realizes they might actually lose access to you permanently. I agreed to meet him at my house, not a cafe, not neutral territory, because I wasn't meeting him as a daughter asking for approval. I was meeting him as an adult standing on her own ground. And when he arrived, he stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment, like he didn't quite know where to place himself anymore. The house still unfamiliar, the dynamics still shifting. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where friends laughed easily, where conversations flowed without agendas, and he folded his hands in front of him, stared at the surface, and said he'd been doing a lot of thinking since the wedding, since the fallout, since the legal scare, and that he realized something he didn't like about himself, which was that he'd been proud of me only once my success became undeniable to others. He said it slowly, like each word cost him something, and admitted that when my aunt mentioned the house, his first instinct hadn't been joy, it had been embarrassment. Not because I owned it, but because he didn't know, because it made him look uninformed, disconnected, like a failure as a parent in front of people whose opinions he cared about, and that realization had been eating at him. He told me he'd always believed he was being fair, that he loved both his children equally, that he assumed I was fine because I never asked for help, never complained, never made noise, and I stopped him there and told him that silence is not proof of strength. It's often evidence of resignation, and that children learn very early which emotions are rewarded and which are ignored. He nodded slowly, eyes glossy, and said he understood that now, that he saw how often he'd redirected conversations, how often he'd assumed my independence meant I didn't need attention, how he'd confused competence with self-sufficiency and used that confusion to justify neglect. He admitted something then that surprised me. He said part of the reason he focused so heavily on my cousin and other relatives was because their needs were obvious, visible, loud, and that mine were quiet, subtle, and required curiosity he didn't exercise, and that instead of leaning in, he leaned away because it was easier. I asked him why it took a public moment, a room full of people freezing, for that realization to land, and he didn't deflect. He said because shame is a powerful teacher and he'd been insulated from it until then, because as long as my success stayed invisible, he could tell himself comforting stories about being a good father, and once the truth was exposed, those stories collapsed. We sat in that for a while, the air heavy but honest, and then he asked me what I needed from him now, not to fix things instantly, not to erase the past, but to move forward without continuing the same damage. And that question mattered because it wasn't framed as a demand, it was framed as a request. I told him I needed consistency, not gestures, not grand apologies, but sustained effort without expectation of reward, curiosity without entitlement, interest without ownership. And I needed him to understand that rebuilding trust doesn't come with a timeline or a guarantee. He said he could do that he wanted to, and I told him wanting isn't the same as doing, but it was a start. When he left that evening, I didn't feel relief or closure, just cautious openness, the kind that leaves the door unlocked but not wide open. What I didn't know yet was that while my father was reckoning quietly, someone else was preparing a move that would test every boundary I'd put in place. Because a week later, I received an invitation that felt harmless on the surface, but carried the weight of everything unresolved underneath. An invitation to a family gathering hosted by my aunt, framed as a reconciliation dinner, a chance to bring everyone together, to heal, to move past misunderstandings, and every instinct in me said this wasn't about healing, it was about regaining control of the narrative. I declined politely, citing work, distance, timing, and within hours my phone started lighting up again, messages layered with urgency, telling me my absence would speak volumes, that refusing to attend would deepen rifts, that I was being inflexible, and I realized then that reconciliation offered on someone else's terms is just compliance in disguise. I didn't argue, I didn't justify, I simply said no again, and that's when the tone changed entirely, because when politeness fails, people reveal their true leverage, and my aunt called me directly, voice sharp, asking how I could be so selfish after everything the family had been through, how I could prioritize my work over blood, how I could forget who helped raise me. I let her talk, let the accusations spill out, and when she paused for breath, I asked her calmly what exactly she wanted from me at this dinner, and she said she wanted unity, closure, a reset, and I asked if unity meant acknowledging how things had been or pretending they hadn't happened, and she snapped that dredging up the past was unproductive. That was the moment everything crystallized, because people who benefit from dysfunction always want to move on without understanding it, and I told her that moving on without accountability is just repeating patterns with better manners. She accused me of holding grudges, of weaponizing my success, of punishing the family for not keeping up with me, and I told her that boundaries aren't weapons, they're fences, and fences exist to protect what's inside, not to attack what's outside. She hung up on me, and within days the story circulating through extended family shifted again, from me being distant to me being arrogant, cold, ungrateful, and I watched it happen with a strange detachment, because once you see how narratives are constructed, you stop internalizing them. I focused instead on the life in front of me, the projects that mattered, the people who showed up without agendas, the routines that grounded me, and somewhere in that steadiness I realized something important, that I no longer felt the need to correct the record, to defend myself, to explain, because the people who mattered already knew, and the ones who didn't never would, without losing something themselves. But just as that peace settled in, just as the noise receded into something manageable, the message arrived from the one person I hadn't expected to hear from at all, my mother's sister, the quiet one, the observer, the one who'd always watched family dynamics with careful eyes and rarely intervened. Her message was short but loaded, asking if we could talk, saying she had information I deserved to know before I made any permanent decisions about who I allowed in my life. I hesitated before responding, because curiosity can be a trap, but something told me this wasn't manipulation, it was disclosure, and when we spoke she didn't waste time. She told me that the dinner invitation hadn't been about reconciliation at all, that it had been planned as a collective appeal, a coordinated attempt to pressure me in person, to surround me with emotion and expectation until I softened, and that when I declined they'd scrambled, frustrated that the stage they'd set wouldn't be used. She told me things I hadn't known, conversations I hadn't been part of, assumptions made about my assets, plans discussed without my consent, and as she spoke I felt a familiar calm return, the kind that comes when your instincts are validated. She apologized for not stepping in sooner, said she hadn't realized how bad it was until the wedding, until she saw the shock on my parents' faces, until she understood how invisible I'd been allowed to become, and she told me something else that mattered deeply, that not everyone in the family agreed with how I'd been treated, that some had noticed, had been uncomfortable, but hadn't known how to intervene without becoming targets themselves. That knowledge didn't excuse the silence, but it contextualized it, and when we hung up I felt lighter, not because the family was fixed, but because the truth was clearer. I sat alone that night, thinking about power, about how it shifts when you stop chasing approval, about how quickly dynamics change when access is revoked, and I understood that what I was experiencing wasn't rejection, it was recalibration. People were adjusting to a version of me they couldn't control, and that discomfort was theirs to manage, not mine. Still, I knew there would be one final confrontation, because families built on hierarchy rarely accept change quietly, and the next move would likely come from the person who felt the most threatened by that shift, the one whose identity had been most dependent on the old order. And as I checked my phone before bed and saw a missed call from my aunt, no voicemail, just silence, I knew the reckoning wasn't over yet. It was simply gathering momentum, and whatever came next would force everyone involved to choose between truth and comfort, and that choice would define who remained in my life and who became part of a past I no longer needed to revisit. The call finally came late at night when silence had settled in enough to make everything sound louder than it was, and I knew before answering that this was the confrontation everyone had been circling without saying out loud, because people don't keep dialing when they have nothing to lose. They keep dialing when they feel power slipping through their fingers. My aunt's voice was controlled in a way that told me she'd rehearsed. Not calm, but calculated. The kind of calm people use when they believe they're about to regain the upper hand. And she opened by saying she was hurt, disappointed, confused about why I was pushing family away after everything they'd done for me. And I let her talk because interruption would have turned it into noise instead of information. She accused me of rewriting history, of exaggerating neglect, of punishing people for not reading my mind. And then she pivoted exactly where I expected, to money, to responsibility, to the idea that success comes with obligation, that when you rise you carry everyone with you, especially family, especially elders, especially those who supported you growing up. I asked her to be specific because vagueness is a shield, and when she said the family felt abandoned by my absence, I asked which family, who exactly had shown up for me consistently when there was nothing to gain, and she didn't answer directly. She deflected to effort, to intention, to how hard parenting is, how no one gets it right. And I told her intention without impact is just an excuse people use to avoid accountability. She bristled at that, accused me of sounding cold, transactional, and I told her clarity often feels cold to people who benefit from confusion. That's when she said the thing she thought would land hardest, that my parents were aging, that time was limited, that one day I'd regret drawing lines so sharply, and I felt the familiar tug of guilt try to latch on before sliding right off because fear of future regret is one of the oldest manipulation tactics there is, and I told her regret cuts both ways. That parents who don't invest emotionally when access is free often panic when access becomes conditional, and that grief isn't reserved only for those who lose children. It's also experienced by children who grow up unseen. She snapped then, dropped the careful tone, accused me of acting superior, of letting money change me, of thinking I was better than everyone else, and I told her money didn't change me. It just removed my dependence on people who mistook proximity for entitlement. She laughed sharply and said I was turning my back on my roots, and I told her roots aren't chains, they're foundations, and healthy foundations don't crack when you stand tall. The conversation spiraled after that, accusations overlapping, her insisting I owed the family access, time, generosity, me insisting that access is earned through respect, not blood alone, and somewhere in the middle of it she admitted what I'd suspected all along, that the family was afraid of what my independence represented, afraid that if I didn't need them then their version of family lost its leverage, and that fear had turned into resentment dressed up as concern. When the call ended, it wasn't dramatic. There was no yelling, just a tired finality, and I sat there staring at my phone realizing that this was the line in the sand, the moment where pretending any longer would cost more than honesty ever could. The fallout was immediate but quieter than expected. Messages slowed. Invitations stopped. The noise receded not because things were resolved but because resistance had exhausted itself, and in that quiet I felt something unexpected, not loneliness but relief, because constant tension, even familiar tension, drains you in ways you don't notice until it's gone. I went back to my routines, my work, the parts of my life that had always been steady regardless of who noticed, and that steadiness became the anchor I hadn't realized I'd been missing while navigating family chaos. Weeks passed, then months, and the absence of drama revealed something important, which was how much emotional labor I'd been performing just to maintain appearances, how much energy had gone into managing other people's feelings instead of living my own life fully, and as that energy returned to me, I felt sharper, more present, more grounded. I started noticing small things. How conversations with friends felt lighter without the weight of explaining myself, how decisions came easier without the echo of imagined judgment, how sleep improved when my nervous system wasn't braced for the next emotional ambush. Then one afternoon a package arrived, unmarked, no return address, and inside was a photo album, old, worn, the kind people keep hidden, filled with pictures from my childhood I'd never seen before, candid shots, moments where I was laughing, focused, building, learning, and tucked inside was a note from my father, handwritten, shaky, saying he'd found it while cleaning, that he didn't know why he'd kept it separate, that looking through it now he could see what he'd missed, and that he wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, just acknowledging the truth. That note didn't fix anything, but it mattered because it didn't ask for anything in return, and I realized then that accountability without demand is rare, and when it happens it deserves to be acknowledged even if it doesn't reopen doors. I wrote him back briefly, thanking him for the honesty, telling him I was glad he was reflecting, and leaving it there because growth doesn't need immediate reward to be real. Around the same time word reached me through the family grapevine that dynamics were shifting in my absence, that conversations had become uncomfortable without a scapegoat or a success story to redirect attention to, that people were being forced to sit with their own choices instead of projecting them onto me, and while part of me felt vindicated, a larger part felt detached, because validation loses its charge once you stop seeking it. I focused instead on building forward, on opportunities that required my full attention, on relationships that felt reciprocal, And in doing so, I noticed how my capacity for joy expanded when it wasn't constantly being negotiated. But just when it felt like equilibrium had been restored, a new variable entered the equation, subtle but significant, because silence doesn't always mean resolution. Sometimes it means regrouping, and the message I received one morning hinted at a final attempt to reassert control, an invitation framed as an olive branch, but heavy with implication, suggesting a private meeting, neutral ground, no agenda, just conversation, and I recognized the pattern immediately, the attempt to reset the board without acknowledging the last game had ended. I didn't respond right away, not out of indecision, but out of discernment, because not every invitation deserves an answer, and the ability to pause is itself a form of power. When I finally replied, it was brief and clear, stating my boundaries plainly, no triangulation, no group pressure, no emotional ambushes, honesty or nothing, and the response I received confirmed everything I needed to know. Defensiveness wrapped in politeness, conditional respect, language that sounded reasonable but avoided responsibility, and I understood then that this wasn't about reconnecting. It was about restoring the old hierarchy, and that hierarchy no longer existed. I chose not to engage further, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as self-preservation, because peace is built by subtraction as much as addition, and some relationships only function when you shrink yourself to fit their comfort. As time continued to pass, the narrative around me stabilized into something simpler, less dramatic, less charged, and that simplicity became the real reward, the absence of constant explanation, the freedom to exist without commentary, the space to grow without being pulled back into roles I'd outgrown. I learned something crucial in that season, which was that closure doesn't always come from confrontation or apology. It often comes from clarity, from understanding why things were the way they were, and choosing differently going forward. I didn't need my family to change to validate my experience. I needed to trust my own perception enough to act on it. And once I did that, the rest fell into place naturally. There was no final showdown, no dramatic reconciliation, just a quiet acceptance that some chapters end not with a bang, but with a door closing gently behind you, and that ending can still be complete. What lingered wasn't bitterness, but a steady confidence, the kind that comes from aligning your life with your values instead of your history, and I realized that whatever came next, whatever conversations resurfaced, whatever attempts were made to pull me back into old dynamics, I now had the clarity to recognize them for what they were, and the strength to respond or not respond accordingly. And as I moved forward, grounded in that clarity, I knew one thing with certainty, that the life I was building no longer revolved around proving anything to anyone, and that freedom, more than any validation, was the real inheritance I'd earned. The real shift didn't announce itself with a confrontation or a dramatic reveal. It arrived quietly in the weeks that followed, in the way people started treating me when they realized the old levers no longer worked, because when control disappears, the mask slips, and what's left is always more honest than any apology. I noticed it first in the tone of messages that came through third parties, cousins suddenly reaching out under the guise of catching up, old acquaintances resurfacing with questions that weren't really questions but probes, testing whether access had been restored, whether proximity to my life now came with benefits again. I answered politely but briefly, because politeness is not permission, and distance is often the clearest form of communication. What fascinated me wasn't the outreach itself, but the assumptions behind it. The idea that time passing automatically resets boundaries, that silence means softness, that choosing peace is the same as surrender, and watching those assumptions fail one by one was strangely educational. I began to see the family system for what it had always been, a hierarchy disguised as love, where attention flowed upward and accountability flowed nowhere, and once you step outside that structure, the entire thing starts wobbling, because systems built on imbalance require constant participation to survive. My parents tried a different approach next, subtler, more measured, sending updates instead of demands, stories instead of requests, hoping familiarity would reopen doors that obligation no longer could. And I listened without reacting, because listening doesn't mean absorbing, and silence doesn't mean agreement. They talked about health scares that weren't emergencies, about friends whose children were struggling, about holidays that felt emptier than expected, and I could hear the unspoken subtext in every word, the quiet hope that guilt would do what authority no longer could. But guilt only works when you believe you've done something wrong, and I didn't. What I had done was choose myself after years of being optional, and that choice didn't require justification. The longer I stayed consistent, the clearer it became that consistency was the thing they hadn't planned for. Because people who rely on emotional leverage expect fluctuation, they expect you to bend eventually, and when you don't, they're forced to confront a truth they've been avoiding, that the relationship changed because it had to, not because you wanted revenge, not because you were cold, but because the old version was unsustainable. There was a moment months in when my mother said something unintentionally revealing during a rare phone call. She said she missed how close we used to be, and without thinking I asked her when exactly she believed that closeness existed, because closeness requires mutual presence, not just shared space, and she couldn't answer. Not because she didn't care, but because nostalgia often edits out the parts that don't fit the story we want to tell ourselves. That pause told me more than any apology ever could, because it confirmed that we weren't grieving the same thing. She was grieving the loss of access, and I was grieving the absence of attunement that had existed long before any boundary was drawn. Around that time, I started getting invitations again, carefully worded, small gatherings instead of big events, framed as low pressure, just family, no expectations, and I declined without explanation because explanations invite debate, and my boundaries were not a negotiation. The interesting part was how the refusals were received, not with anger but with confusion, because refusal without hostility is disarming. It doesn't give people anything to push against, and that forced a reckoning that loud conflict never does. I could sense the narrative shifting behind the scenes, from I was ungrateful to I was distant, from I was difficult to I was different. And while none of those labels were accurate, they were progress, because difference acknowledges autonomy, and autonomy is the one thing systems like this cannot tolerate for long without collapsing. My aunt made one final attempt months later, reaching out directly with a message that read like concern but carried the weight of expectation, saying she worried I was isolating myself, that independence could turn into loneliness if I wasn't careful, and I remember reading it slowly, recognizing the tactic immediately, fear dressed as care, the suggestion that my choices were dangerous, that autonomy had a cost I hadn't considered. I replied calmly, telling her I was not isolated, I was selective, and that the two are not the same, and I wished her well. She didn't respond, and that silence was its own answer. What followed after that was something I hadn't anticipated, a sense of emotional spaciousness that allowed me to reflect without reactivity, to examine my past without being pulled back into it, and I realized how much of my identity had been shaped in opposition to my family rather than in alignment with myself. That awareness changed the way I approached everything, from work to friendships to the way I spoke to myself, because when you're no longer performing resilience for an audience that doesn't appreciate it, you get to rest, and rest reveals who you actually are beneath survival strategies. I started noticing how often I'd minimized my own needs to keep the peace, how often I'd explained myself to people who weren't listening, how often I'd accepted crumbs of validation because they came from familiar hands, and seeing that clearly was uncomfortable but liberating, because clarity strips away illusion and leaves choice in its place. The family dynamic didn't magically heal, but it stabilized into something predictable, distant but less volatile, and predictability is underrated when you've lived in emotional chaos. There were moments of sadness, of course, especially around milestones, birthdays that passed quietly, holidays spent elsewhere, but the sadness was clean, not tangled in resentment or hope, just an acknowledgement of what was and what wasn't, and that kind of sadness doesn't weigh you down, it passes through. Then something unexpected happened. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out privately, not to ask for anything, not to mediate, but to say she'd been watching from the sidelines, that my decision had given her language for things she'd felt but never articulated, and that she was starting to question her own role in the family. That message mattered more than any apology I'd received, because it showed me that boundaries don't just protect you, they model possibilities for others, even when you never intended to lead. More messages like that followed over time, quiet acknowledgments from people who weren't ready to act but were beginning to see, and I realized that change in systems like this is rarely immediate or dramatic. It's incremental. It spreads through observation, not confrontation. I didn't become closer to my parents, but I became closer to myself, and that shift altered every relationship in my life for the better because I no longer showed up hoping to be understood. I showed up already understanding myself. The craving for approval faded not because I received it, but because I outgrew the version of me that needed it, and that growth didn't make me hard, it made me grounded. I stopped rehearsing conversations that never happened, stopped imagining explanations that would finally make things click, and started investing that energy into building a life that felt aligned rather than impressive. When people asked about my family, I answered honestly but briefly, without defensiveness, because I didn't need to convince anyone anymore, and that quiet confidence changed how I was perceived far more than any achievement ever had. There was no final scene where everyone came together and understood each other. No cinematic closure, just a series of choices made consistently over time that led me somewhere better. And that's the part no one tells you. That healing often looks boring from the outside, but feels profound on the inside. I learned that walking away doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough about yourself to stop accepting less than you deserve. And that love without respect is not love. It's control wearing a familiar face. The story didn't end with reconciliation, it ended with autonomy, and autonomy doesn't need witnesses to be valid. As I moved forward, the curiosity shifted from why they acted the way they did to what I wanted next, and that question opened doors that had nothing to do with family at all. Doors built on mutual respect, shared values, and the freedom to show up fully without shrinking. And if there's one thing this entire journey taught me, it's that the most powerful form of closure is not getting the last word. It's living well without needing it. And if you're watching this wondering whether setting boundaries will cost you connection, the truth is it will cost you conditional connection and reveal the real thing, either with others or with yourself. And the next time you hear from me, I'll be talking about what happens after you choose yourself and the world starts responding differently, not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped negotiating your worth. And that shift changes everything in ways you don't see coming until you're already living them.